following the theme of rooted in the divine, is about focusing on the impersonal and the power that's in the impersonal. And to make that point, there were things that I wanted to share, and they come in stories. And as most of you know by now, I really like to illustrate and use stories as the way to capitalize on the kinds of things that we can do. David's song, Come Home, in it, he actually has, in the recording, he has some of the sound from the movie The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy talks about coming home. That theme, that story of coming home, I think is a great connection with the idea of the impersonal. Because what happens with the impersonal, we cannot help but in our human minds, also, it generates the idea of the personal, right? Because if I mention the impersonal, I don't know about you, but I know about me, that I can't help but think about its opposite. So, when we say something like home, an implication that home makes is going away, going out into the world. For some, you say up, what other idea comes to mind? Down. Down. We tend as human beings to think in opposites. And that really gets exaggerated in the Western culture. The story of coming home is such a deep and repeating narrative that we can find it in story after story after story. That we go out into the world and we meet the world, and we meet the world in all its impersonal, I could care less about you kinds of flavors. And the idea of coming home is that we can let go and we no longer have to be stung by that impersonal disconnect, by that sense of, does anybody out there care? The first story that struck me when I was reviewing this is that story that Jesus told that's often referred to as the prodigal son. Familiar with that one? Okay. Father has two sons. The younger son steps forward and says, hey dude, I want to cash out my inheritance now. A pretty daring sort of thing. So, dad sells off those 40 acres. Son cashes that out, and what does he do? Does he stay home to help out? Does he expand that 40 acreage? No. What does he do? He goes away. And it is described that he squanders it. He spends it in the most frivolous ways possible. And what happens? It doesn't end well for him, does it? No, as the story ends up, he goes through all of the money and he finds himself, and this is particularly offensive for a Jewish person, he finds himself at a farm raising the pigs. Now, in Jewish tradition, being with swine is not a great thing. Now, to be honest, I really can't think of many traditions where being with swine is a great thing. I mean, I don't know that it's stellar, but I would just say that notion of ending up with swine is not a great thing. And he is just thinking to himself, he's beating himself up, saying, boy, was I really foolish. And he says, you know what? The people that are the workers in my father's home do far better off than I'm doing now. I can't even eat what I'm feeding the pigs. I'm going to go home. Now, one of the things about that story is there's two other characters. There's the father, and then there's the older brother. Now, the thing about the father, the person who exemplifies and embodies being home, every day, that father has gone on to the very edge of his lands, searching for his son. For while his son has gone away, the father has never, ever forgotten about him. He has always held him close in his heart. So in the face of his son encountering all that's impersonal, there is something that is so personally deep, counting on his return, waiting for his arrival home. As I grew up, I started to learn that the real point of the story is not the son, but it's about that father. It's about that element of the divine that is always seeking us. What we are called to do is we are called to respond. How many times do we, like that younger son, hit rock bottom before we finally say, oh, I guess there's something else for me besides this rock bottom? When the son comes home, his father is waiting for him. And not only is he waiting for him, he wants to throw him a party. Now, in the story, the older brother, he comes home from his long day working in the fields, and he sees this party going on. Now, does he get into the party? Woohoo! I'm going to celebrate. Come on, my brother's back. He's feeling a little bit, what shall we say, resentful?
Nose out of joint.
Nose out of joint. He's feeling like, what the heck? I stay here and I suffer. I suffer here. I worked so hard and nobody's ever thrown a party for me. Hate to break it to you, but I could so identify with that older son. You know, oh, I'm always so responsible. I'm never the one to take that easy light road. I'm always the one to put the responsibility on my back. And in the story, rather than siding with really either son, the father said is, you know, you could have had a party any time. There was nothing stopping you from having a party. And that's that impersonal quality of the divine. The divine is always ready to give, but there's something in us that is not always ready to celebrate. There's something in us that holds a certain set of expectations. So what is it that we are to do based on this story? Well, there's another story about homecoming, and I think it's particularly pertinent for this week. The movie A Wrinkle in Time came out on Friday. And A Wrinkle in Time has been a very deep and meaningful story for me because it was a story that was read to us. One chapter was read every day during 5th grade. And if our class was good, we would get to hear the story. If our class had not behaved appropriately, the story would be delayed. So, for whatever reason, at that time in the early 1970s, there was something about hearing that story because, I may remind you, there were not books on tape in this era. There was not that easy movement of young adult literature making its transition from books to film that I could then pop down in front of TV and watch. There was something about the power of imagination that Madeleine L'Engle captured. And one of the things that I want to mention is that Madeleine L'Engle was engaged with and bringing forward to a larger community, adults and children alike, because it was adults that were often reading these stories to children. Mm-hmm. She was talking about the nature of physics. She was talking about science as it was being uncovered. The magic of physics, the magic of what was available. And it was the same work that was inspiring Earnest Holmes. She was someone that was having conversations with Thomas Merton. She would have dinner parties with Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. She was meeting with some of the people that were the contemporaries of Earnest Holmes. And they were all coming together to wrestle about these ideas. These ideas about how our thoughts and how our feelings go out into the impersonal universe, and the impersonal universe empowers those. How many of you are familiar with the story of A Wrinkle in Time? Okay, so you know the main character is a young girl named Meg. And Meg is at a very awkward point in her life. She's smart enough. Her father is missing. And nobody can really explain where he's gone. Meg does not feel good enough. Her mother is an accomplished physician and experimental sciences. She's got two twins who seem ordinary enough. They get good grades, they're good in sports, they've got their acts together. She's got a much younger brother, Charles Wallace. And Charles Wallace didn't speak until he was 4 years old, which, as many of you know, is a little bit what you would say developmentally delayed. But Charles Wallace was anything but developmentally delayed. He just was developing in his own pace, at his own time. The story begins with a wild, windy night. And a vagrant shows up at their house. And this is a very vagrant that Charles Wallace had had a conversation with earlier in the week. As the story unfolds, this vagrant, a woman named Mrs. Whatsit, lets them make the acquaintance of Miss Who and Mrs. Which. And these three characters, Mrs. Whatsit, Miss Who, and Miss Which, support Meg and Charles Wallace in finding out what happened with their father. The story is about how Meg helps to find her father and helps to bring her father back home. It's a story that twists the prodigal son on its head, because instead of it being the father that is going out, it is Meg who goes out. And instead of it being the father who is a wealthy landowner, who has enough to be able to divide a property and give to two sons, it's a story of a girl who is feeling torn apart. How often do we feel torn apart in our lives? How often do we feel that what we are looking for, what we are seeking, is what we need desperately because what we have before us is not satisfactory? One of the other characters who gets pulled in is a boy named Calvin, who's a moderately popular, moderately smart, athletic character at the school. And he has always felt like a bit of an outsider in his own family. And for whatever reason, he feels more at home with Meg and with her family. He joins in this adventure, in this wrinkle through time. Because what gets described is that their father went away through a process called tessering. And tessering is where you move through time and space by wrinkling it. Today's language is that there's a black hole. That we can be in one place and then in another place in an instant. It's all very science fiction, and yet it's not. Because with the power of our thinking, with the power of our own thoughts, we have equal access to those kinds of sudden shifts. Now, often we don't necessarily feel powerful enough to make those shifts. That's where that impersonal, or what gets described in the science of mind literature as that automatic action of the law. In the science of mind teachings, we identify 3 ways that God shows up, that Spirit shows up, that the divine has expression. It shows up as mind. It shows up as soul or law. And it shows up as body. And the body is the manifest of God. Each of us is a place of that manifest expression. And yet each of us are also microcosms of that. Each of us participate in the mind of the divine. One of the things that's very irritating about this faith tradition is that middle section, the law. Doesn't it irritate you sometimes? I know it irritates me sometimes that people who are completely unworthy can get what they want.
Yes.
You know, you really, I don't know, I was really raised that, you know, if you work hard enough, and if you're kind enough, and if you're all of those things, then you get what you want. But there are some people who are not particularly kind, who are not particularly thoughtful about others, who do get lots of what they want.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name any names, but I think we could all probably make a very short, you know, very quick list that would fill both of our hands with people who get what they want when we don't think that they should get what they want. And we also, inversely, we can say, I didn't get what I wanted, and I should have. So it's this sense of shaking the fist at the law, saying, why aren't I getting it? Well, sometimes we're not getting it because we have set up so many circuitous routes about what are the steps for this reward system to get expressed, that we cannot possibly live up to our own ideas. One of the things that the person who wrote about this week identified is that this teaching can confuse us about something like building ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And that's notion that if I work hard enough, if I pray hard enough, if I pray long enough, if I think enough, if I do enough, if we do that, then we can build ourselves up. The problem is that we're only using those as our sandbags against that rushing water of our own sense of incompetence, our own sense of inadequacy, our own sense of how we're not good enough. The law doesn't pay any attention to all of those sandbags that we try to pull up. The law is just moving in accord with our beliefs. So when things aren't turning out the way that we're wanting them to, rather than being an opportunity to raise our fist at the divine and say, you know, you went to the edge of your property every day, but you never left the damn property and came after me. Ugh! I don't know about you, but I know that I have felt that way. You could have come a little further. Could have met me a little closer. Meg gets to that point in the story. I mean, she gets her wish fulfilled. They find her father. But they find him, and she is none too sweet to him when they find him, because they find her father, but she loses her brother in the process. And I'll tell you, she's mighty upset with her father. She's like, you should never let that happen. Do you know how irresponsible that was of you? He came here for you. How often do we let that kind of fuel energize us? And the impersonal just sweeps us up in that. I can't speak to you, but I can speak to me. This past week, I was letting myself get caught up in a fuel. I was told by someone that I was going to do something, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I was like, you want to bet? I'll show you there's something I can do about it. It really took a lot to be able to keep coming. You know, I was saying to Mykal, I have not been so infuriated by anything at work in years. It took spiritual practice to be able to go and say, I really pray for their highest and best. I really pray for this person, for this for this, for this, for this. There's a discipline, a capacity to step out of the personal, to believe that this really, that this was a target to me. I was just a way to make things easier. And if I was not going to stand up in the way of it being easier, I would have been the way to make it easier. Leaning into that impersonal power is where each of us do have power. In the story, Meg is given a gift, but she has to discover what it is for herself. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because that would kind of spoil it if you've forgotten it or haven't read it recently. But Mrs. Witch says, I give you a gift, but I can't tell you what it is. Mrs. Witch is giving all of us that gift. We're all given an amazing gift, an amazing capacity. But part of that is our own ability to utilize it, to discover it. Because to the extent that we don't engage in an active discovery, we are not engaging in the power that the divine has for us. I'll tell you, the moment that she discovers her gift is the moment that she's able to turn things around. The gift is not something all that difficult to imagine or perceive, but she needs just the right circumstances to recognize it. So my invitation for these stories is to remember what the stories have to tell us. The divine, the impersonal power is available to all of us. Now sometimes it's very frustrating. We hate having to hit rock bottom. Or maybe I'm overspeaking. I know that I have hated when I've had to hit rock bottom. Maybe others enjoy that process a little more than me. But sometimes that story arc of being able to find myself discouraged or being able to find myself at my wit's end is the place where I'm able to reach out to others. Sometimes I am so intent on doing it myself. I mean, really, that's the story of the younger brother. He was really intent. I've gone off on my own. I've got to fix this on my own. And his aha moment is, I don't really have to do this. I don't really have to be in the pig trough with the pigs. There's no requirement. I could go back. I could be a servant at my dad's house, and I'd be treated way better than I am here. And I wouldn't have to hang out with pigs anymore. It would be a pretty good thing. The best that he can imagine is not even close to what he ends up encountering. The best that his brother had to imagine, that he just had to slave away thanklessly for the rest of his life, and his bitterness about that was both of those were released. His dad is like, hey, dude, you could have asked any time. That impersonal, automatic action of the law is like, all you had to do was ask and it was yours. But you know what? Sometimes we have to open our mouths. Sometimes we have to reach out and seek. The younger brother actually had a much harder path in it. At the end of it, the beginning of it was pretty good actually. His being able to go through all of that. In the story of Meg, she starts out feeling very powerless. And yet, at the end of the story, she's the one who has brought it all about, and with the help of this guy Calvin, and with the help of her beloved father, and her beloved mother, and her beloved Mrs. Witch, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who. I invite us in our stories as we encounter the impersonal, to lean into that power that we have available to us. To recognize that when we feel powerless, there is power available to us. That recognition is a cue, is a hint. There's something for us. And that recognition also may be recognizing that we don't have to do it alone. That we are connected. And that we have the capacity to make connections. The last thing that the writer for this week's inspiration talked about is sometimes we can use our easy times as ways to get into practice for using the power that we have. We don't always have to wait until we're at the end of our rope or at the end of the string, at the end of the line. We can have things going just fine. And we can use these as ways to build our strength, to build our capacities. We also don't have to take personal responsibility, because we live in a world where there is a connectedness, where each of us come from a background of supports, where each of us have been a background of supports for others. And rather than pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, that we have all kinds of histories that have guided us here. How do we move forward? How do we advance history in a way that celebrates the best possible today that there can be? Welcome home. And so it is.
So it is.